come back to some of these. But
yeah.
what did he do around Boston?
Well, in Boston, he goes up in July 1775, and he takes control of the
All of this program available on our website at cspan.org. We now take you to the U.S. House. They're gaveling in for morning hour speeches, legislative work beginning at noon, including rules governing spending bills for 2014. Live coverage of the House on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., July 23, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Thomas Massie to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
I appreciate the groundwork that is being carefully laid by Senate Finance Chair Baucus and Ways and Means Chair Camp. It's absolutely essential that we reform a tax code that is hopelessly complex, unfair, and often counterproductive. The system is reaching the point of breakdown. The complex patchwork is difficult to administer, invites tax engineering, if not outright evasion, and is hugely expensive for those who are just trying to meet their obligations. Through mistake and evasion, we lose approximately $365 billion of revenue each year that should be paid to the Treasury, $1 billion a day. And the estimated cost of compliance is $168 billion. With simplification and careful enforcement, we could easily gain tens of billions of dollars of revenue and allow individual taxpayers and businesses to shift resources away from compliance and tax engineering to growing the economy and providing for our families. While we all may disagree with some fundamentals, it would be a mistake to begin with our areas of disagreement. I commend the Chairman for working to build common understanding on a path forward. But there is one area that has not been part of the tax reform discussion, but is every bit as critical as solving our budget deficit. That's to deal with our infrastructure deficit. Every day brings more stories of a nation slowly falling apart and falling behind other nations that are modernizing their infrastructure, like Japan, China, India, and the European Union, all of whom spend more of their economy than does the United States. Last week's potential water emergency in Prince George's County underscores a point made by my friend Representative Don Young from Alaska. We leak more water than we drink. 1.9 trillion gallons of water lost due to inadequate infrastructure underground. It's water, sewer, the electrical grid, transit, roads, and bridges. The American Society of Civil Engineers has estimated we need to spend $2.3 trillion in the next 5 years just to maintain basic standards. Transportation reauthorization is under the committee's jurisdiction, and it's fast approaching, with the Highway Trust Fund unable to meet even current inadequate requirements. This resource gap prevented us from being able to enact a full 6-year reauthorization last Congress. Hence, we're facing it again next year. In the 20 years since the gas tax was last increased, the purchasing power of the fund has eroded dramatically due to inflation and increased fuel economy, so that the average motorist is only paying about half as much per mile as they did in 1993. The failure to meet the revenue needs has increased borrowing from the general fund, adding $55 billion to the deficit just to meet the current inadequate levels. At the same time, we've seen a collapse in the construction industry, costing hundreds of thousands of family wage jobs and slowing our economic recovery. Resources have become increasingly inadequate to meet basic transportation needs, but at the same time, the consensus among key road users in support of an increase has grown ever stronger. A vast coalition has emerged in support of raising the fuel tax, includes business, the professions, organized labor, non-governmental organizations, the truckers, transit, cyclists. The list of supporters is as long as it is varied. Allowing an inflationary increase for the Highway Trust Fund was part of the Clinton deficit reduction plan back when we had balanced budgets. More recently, it was included in the recommendation of the chairs of the President's Deficit Reduction Committee, Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles. Making infrastructure a part of the larger tax reform proposal will meet a critical and growing need for our economy. It will help satisfy the concerns of those who are insisting on more revenue, but do so in a manner that's supported by a broad, diverse, and indeed powerful coalition of interests. We all have a stake in funding to rebuild and renew America. It's not just the quickest way to put people back to work, but also make our communities more livable, our families safer, healthier, and more economically secure, and it just might be the smoothest path to tax reform as well.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with only 6 legislative days left before the Congress departs for August recess, I'm increasingly concerned that we will not learn This is due in large part to the secretive nature of the investigations to date. Most of the key hearings into what happened that night in Benghazi have happened behind closed doors in classified settings, including a June hearing with General Carter Ham, who was head of U.S. forces in Africa the night of the attack. That is why I was surprised to hear comments made by General Ham at the Aspen Security Forum last week, where he spoke freely about the U.S. response to the attack. Does it bother any of my colleagues that General Ham can publicly speak about the military's response at a forum in Aspen, Colorado, where the tickets were $1,200. The American people should not have to pay $1,200. And yet his testimony before Congress was behind closed doors. According to a CNN report, General Ham told the Aspen audience that by the time an American drone arrived above the U.S. consulate, quote, the attack on the mission was winding down. By that time, quote, Ham knew Ambassador Stevens was missing and believed he could have been possibly kidnapped. General Ham was then quoted saying, quote, in my mind, at that point, we were no longer in response to an attack. We were in a recovery, and frankly, I thought we were in a potential hostage rescue situation. The article continued, quote, Ham said although he had authority to scramble a jet to the scene, he decided there was, quote, not necessity and there was not a clear purpose in doing so. To do what? Ham asked. It was a very, very, very uncertain situation, he said. It was a very uncertain situation indeed. Uncertain as to whether the terrorists held our ambassador as hostage. Uncertain as to whether the terrorists would target the annex, as they did. Uncertain as to whether this situation will last hours, days, weeks, or months, or years. Which raises the question, if his command required no additional authority to respond, what he then believed to be a hostage rescue situation, why did it take another 7 hours before AFRICOM ordered a C-17 aircraft in Germany to deploy to Libya to evacuate Americans? And why did that plane not leave Germany for another 8 hours after that? If the situation appeared to be deteriorating throughout the night at the annex, why wasn't there an additional effort to accelerate air support or even planes to evacuate American personnel directly from Benghazi? And given the betrayal of our supposed allied Libyan militia forces, which were calls to defend the consulate went unheeded, why would the Pentagon not move even faster to ensure there was reliable evacuation and hostage response force to assist the Americans in Benghazi? And given that no American plane arrived in Benghazi to support the evacuation, just what planes were used to evacuate the Americans in the morning of September 12th? The State Department's Accountability Review Board said 2 planes were used to transport Americans from Benghazi to Tripoli. We know that one was a Libyan Air Force C-130 that brought back the bodies of Ambassador Stevens, Sean Smith, Ty Wood, and Glenn Doherty. But the first to depart was a private charter jet. It took off at 7:40 a.m. with evacuees, including all wounded personnel, according to an unclassified version of the report. But just who owned that jet? Who owned that jet? Was it the same jet that brought in the 7-person response team from Tripoli earlier that night? Was it really chartered, or was it commandeered? Was it commandeered? How many wounded were evacuated on that jet? Of the wounded, how many were State Department employees, CIA employees, or security contractors? The ARB said when the first plane arrived in Tripoli, wounded personnel were transferred to a local hospital in exemplary coordination that helped save the lives of 2 severely injured Americans. Despite my letter I sent to Secretary Kerry, I have never received a full counting of how many Americans were injured in the attack. Are any of the wounded still receiving care in military hospitals or other medical facilities? Will we ever officially learn their names and the heroic, they were heroes, the heroic action that night that resulted in their serious injuries? I think we can all agree that it would be constructive for those that were in the chain of command that night to publicly testify and answer these questions. The American people are losing confidence in their government. How will history judge the actions or inaction of the Obama administration and the response of the Congress to the Benghazi attack?
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, CBO's May report shows the deficit has dropped another $220 billion. The federal deficit continues to fall faster now than it has since post-World War II demobilization in the late 40s and early 50s. Earlier this month, OMB released its mid-session review that estimates deficits will be reduced to below 3% of GDP by 2017 and will continue to fall, reaching 2% by 2023. This recent good news hasn't eliminated the need to address our long-term fiscal crisis, but it has created some breathing space for us to renew our investments in America. We're now 5 years removed from the financial crisis and have yet to demonstrate an ability to balance competing needs between the long-term deficit reduction need and investments in the future that made America great. House Republicans have been obsessed by the debt, but struggle to recognize any need for investment in education, R&D, and infrastructure. A few weeks ago, Larry Summers best summarized our predicament when he said, "Just as you burden future generations when you accumulate debt, you also burden future generations when you defer maintenance." Given the current market, we're refusing to maintain our infrastructure at a time when investors are literally throwing money at us. To be clear, yields on the 5-, 7-, and 10-year treasuries have been negative for the past 2 years. Negative. This past month, we've witnessed a rate jump as markets fret about QE3, yet real Treasury yields still remain below 1%. When accounting for inflation, rates have not been this low for many, many decades. Republicans look the other way when it comes to this question, and I'm shocked that my colleagues who persistently say we ought to run the government like a business have so little interest in taking advantage of one of our generation's great opportunities in financing investment for the future. This is a far cry from the party of Lincoln that invested in the Homestead Act, invested in the Transcontinental Railroad, or Eisenhower that invested in the interstate highway system. Unfortunately, Congress continues to fiddle while Rome burns. 2 months ago, the I-5 bridge collapsed in the state of Washington. It was a miracle nobody died, considering that 71,000 vehicles a day use that critical connection, the main route connecting Seattle to British Columbia. According to the U.S. Federal Highway Administration, My own state of Virginia has 3,500, nearly 1 in 4 bridges that are either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete, and we're not unique in America. In addition, many of the country's water mains and pipes are more than 100 years old. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates it will take $298 billion over the next 20 years to fix this situation. Otherwise, many Americans are going to get wastewater when they turn on their faucets. More than 100,000 residents of the National Capital Region learned this the hard way just a week ago when, because of lack of infrastructure maintenance, they almost went without water. Our choice is not to invest in maintaining the critical infrastructure in the backbone of our economy is putting America at a competitive disadvantage in the next century. The Panama Canal, for example, will be completed, its expansion will be completed in 2015, radically altering global trade capacity throughout the world. Yet the East Coast will have only 4 ports capable of receiving the new post-Panamax ships. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reports these new ships will make up 62% of total container ship capacity in the world by 2030. Right now, China and Korea not only surpass the United States in this capacity, they lead in terms of container traffic as well. This didn't happen by accident. They invested. Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that leaving our grandchildren with unsustainable debt is irresponsible. But what are they to think when they look back and realize we left them with a nation of potholes, contaminated water, and crumbling bridges? Our global competitors aren't waiting around for things to pick up here in America. They're actively investing in infrastructure to gain ground in the hopes of overtaking us in global competition. The Chinese spend billions in ports, rail, and highways, and they're not alone. It's time to turn our attention back to the seemingly unglamorous but a critical business of fixing America's infrastructure, our roads, our ports, our airports, our bridges, and our water systems, to ensure for future generations America stays strong. I yield back.
It's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is a very important issue that unfortunately hasn't gotten as much attention lately as it should. You know, I'm a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, spent most of my time in Iraq, but I remember I was in a nation outside of Afghanistan getting ready to fly an airplane one day. This was back in the mid-2000s, and Mr. Speaker, the majority leader from the other chamber basically got on television and said, the war in Iraq is lost. He said it's lost, it's done, it's over. I remember that. Because I was on a treadmill getting ready to go fly a mission into Afghanistan when I heard that. You know, the interesting thing about that is I guarantee you our enemy in Iraq probably cheered loudly at the moment they saw the majority leader from the Senate say those words. We know that something very courageous happened. The President of the United States at the time said, not only is the war not lost, we're sending more troops and we're going to win this thing. And we did. We saw the enemy realize that America could never be defeated on the battlefield, it could only be defeated by its will. And President Bush sent a very strong and loud message that America's will not be defeated. This is a situation we face in Afghanistan today. Look, as a member of Congress, as a politician, the easiest thing for me to do is to stand up here and say the war in Afghanistan is lost and we need to just go home. And I tell you, you look at the polling, and with the lack of a president leading this country on the public opinion side of what we're doing in Afghanistan, I'd probably get a lot of people sending Facebook messages and emails saying, go get them. It's time to leave Afghanistan. But you know what? If I did that, I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror and say that I did the right thing. Because the right thing is generations of people that have lived under oppression and have lived for years under the Taliban regime. They stood up, they kicked the Taliban out of their nation. And they've looked at the United States and said, it took you decades at your inception to get your democracy right. Help us get our democracy right. What's at stake here? I look over here at this picture and I see a couple of things. I see, number one, a girl by the name of Bibi, and if you could see closely at that picture, you would see that she does not have a nose or ears. They were actually cut off by the Taliban. They were cut off by swift justice because somebody in her family committed a crime, sold her into marriage at the age of 14 years old. And at 15 years old, she left her abusive husband, went to her uncle's house, who turned his back on her, and eventually she was captured and apprehended by the Taliban as they forced her family to cut her nose and ears off as justice for running away from a terrible situation. She eventually escaped and went to an American Ford operating base and was saved. And then you see in this other picture, as she lives in the United States, she has a prosthetic nose today and is living as close to a normal life as possible despite the trauma that she suffered. On the bottom down here, you'll see a number of girls in school right now, learning and being educated. You know, before we went into Afghanistan, there were something like 800,000 people in school. Today, it's over 6 million. In fact, did you know that 60% of the Afghan population is under the age of 20? And there's this movement in Afghanistan called the civil society, in which they stand up and say, it's time for freedom and it's time to take our country back. Are you also aware, Mr. Speaker, that every province is now under control of Afghanistan, and the United States has reverted to a training mission and a counterterrorism mission? These are all huge victories for the Afghan people that we ought to be celebrating, but instead, I wake up the other day and I look in the paper, and the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, is saying we are exploring an option after 2014 to take all troops out of Afghanistan. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think that made the Taliban frightened? Or do you think they cheered when they saw the President of the United States say, I'm considering all troops gone after 2014? The whole year of 2014 was pulled out of a hat for political reasons. When you say that we're surging in Afghanistan, but as the last troop goes in, the first troop's coming out from the surge, it's not very effective. You know, the Taliban have a saying, actually. It says, America may have the watches, but we have the time. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, we are on the verge of a clear victory in Afghanistan for the Afghan people. The biggest mistake we can make today is to let politics come into play and to withdraw and leave 0 troops after 2014. In 50 years, history will judge us for that. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in 1999, Congress, sadly, repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. That law, which had protected our nation for over 7 decades against wild speculation by Wall Street, investment houses, and financial giants. When the floodgates were removed between prudent banking and speculative abandon, again Wall Street gambled with the money of the American consumers. Look where it took us. Into the worst recession since the Great Depression, into a world where we've had the largest transfer in American history of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, and the flood continues. Now, your savings deposits and certificates of deposit earn almost no interest. Guess who's making money off of your money? In commemoration of the 80th anniversary of enactment of the Glass-Steagall Act, Congress must adopt the Return to Prudent Banking Act of 2013, H.R. 129. I invite all members to co-sponsor our bipartisan bill to reinstall the floodgates that protected the public from Wall Street greed. The Glass-Steagall Act, or Banking Act of 1933, was signed into law during the Great Depression in an effort to restore order and stability to the banking system. Representative Henry Steagall and Senator Carter Glass wrote the law, and through its passage, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created. The law prevented commercial banks from trading securities with deposits from their clients. After its repeal in 1999, the Wall Street banks, true to form, again created false money with abandon. They used that false money to purchase more mortgage-backed securities, which were packaged into collateralized debt obligations. Most Americans couldn't even define what these instruments were. But Wall Street giants ended up fleecing them by gobbling up an average of 20% of the value of their home equity. Lack of regulation allowed Wall Street to gorge themselves past sustainable ratios. They manipulated consumer mutual funds and pension accounts of American workers, thus ensuring that Americans were on the hook for when the housing bubble burst. Sandy Weil, who helped invent these mad practices, as the former chairman and CEO of Citigroup, in a major reversal stated on CNBC in support of restoring Glass-Steagall, what we should probably do, he said, is go and split up the investment banking from regular banking, have banks be deposit takers, have banks do something that's not going to risk taxpayer dollars. Boy, I wish he'd thought about that before he did it. Wall Street turned our strong banking system into a haven for speculators. They threw caution to the wind, displacing prudence with greed. These money men gained massive profits for the banks. By and large, the American public was unaware of their backroom dealing, but Wall Street took hard-earned American dollars to gamble on complex and risky instruments like derivatives, and then filled the gap with the lost equity of the American people's homes. We now see enormous accumulation of banking assets and vast financial power in a handful of powerful institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock. They are making enormous profits, larger than ever, as a result of the American people having bailed them out. Indeed, they are yielding the highest profits in our nation in addition to the oil companies. 15 years ago, the assets of these 6 largest banks were approximately 17% of gross domestic product. Today, estimates for their assets are over half of GDP. So 6 institutions control an enormous and growing percentage of our banking system. And in turn, our nation's future is placed at their doorstep. This is too much power in too few hands. The American people are feeling it in the restriction of credit, the sluggishness of the housing market and depreciated values, the lack of interest paid on savings deposits and certificates of deposit, in the economy's sluggish growth, and the lack of competitive capital opportunities. In effect, the American people are subsidizing them. In 2012, J.P. Morgan Chase reported record net revenue of $21.3 billion compared to the $19 billion they made in the previous year. For the 3rd consecutive year, the banking giant recorded a record net income. Total revenue for J.P. Morgan Chase in 2012 was nearly $100 billion. That would fully fund the Department of Transportation, NASA, the National Science Foundation, and even bail out Detroit. Yes, let's look at Detroit. This weekend, we saw the city of Detroit file for bankruptcy. The news stories report Detroit is $18 billion short, about a third of it in its pension funds. Well, look at what the financial crisis took from the citizens of Michigan, over $180 billion, 10 times more than the debt that the city of Detroit is juggling. $180 billion in lost property value in Michigan alone. Who should pay Detroiters in Michigan back for what was taken from them? The value of their property. Now there's a math problem for you. I would say to my colleagues, please join us in sponsorship of H.R. 129. Let's put prudence back into banking and keep the speculators out. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, the Washington Times reported, and I quote, "The leading federal research effort into the controversial drilling method known as fracking has turned up no evidence so far linking the process to water contamination, a connection continually drawn by many environmentalist critics, along with some Democrats in Congress," end quote. The report continues stating the Department of Energy research being conducted at a Marcellus Shale natural gas well in western Pennsylvania thus far has shown that chemicals used in the hydraulic fracturing practice have stayed thousands of feet below drinking water supplies, end quotes. Additionally, in April, a determination made by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection found that fracking is not to blame for high methane levels in drinking water in communities in northern Pennsylvania. Mr. Speaker, the United States oil and gas producers would pay an additional $345 million a year, or an average of $96,913 per well, under the United States Bureau of Land Management's amended proposed federal onshore hydraulic fracturing regulations. According to the report, the amended proposal's estimated costs still exceed the $100 million threshold, requiring an economic assessment by the Bureau of Land Management. Now, while changes the Department of Interior made following comments from producers, environmental organizations, and other stakeholders included elimination of a requirement to regulate well maintenance, much more consideration must be given to these burdensome regulations. Local scientists and regulators know the geology where the natural gas extraction occurs. They know the industry. They know how to balance good science and manage the industry's expansion without thwarting innovation, growth, and affordable, reliable energy. Local economies, including many in my district, are booming due to the natural gas industry. The model that is making this possible is based on stringent regulation at the state level, not the heavy hand of the federal government. Mr. Speaker, later this week, the Bipartisan Congressional Natural Gas Caucus will convene a field hearing entitled The Economic Impacts of Shale Production. This will be done at Penn College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. The caucus will receive testimony from local officials and community leaders concerning the economic impacts of natural gas production. We must promote best practices, sound science, and do our very best as communities to manage this rapid growth and promote this industry that is offering prosperity to so many Americans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this has been a summer of alarming revelations that suggest that our government is drifting far from the principles of individual liberty and constitutionally limited government that defined the American founding and that produced the most free and prosperous republic in the history of mankind. These developments include the use of the IRS and other government agencies to single out ordinary Americans because of their political beliefs, with the apparent intent to discourage and intimidate them out of participating in the public policy debate. The use of the Department of Justice to target reporters who are asking embarrassing questions of the administration, in one case with the threat of prosecution under the Espionage Act. The warrantless seizure of the private records of millions of Americans by the National Security Agency. The increasingly menacing militarization of domestic police agencies. The shakedown of health care providers to fund advocacy and promotion of Obamacare. Frequent assertions by the President of authority to nullify laws that he deems objectionable or inconvenient, despite his clear constitutional mandate to see that the laws are faithfully executed. The executive's usurpation of the legislative powers of Congress by using the regulatory bureaucracies to impose laws that the elected Congress has specifically refused to enact. Continued suggestions that the executive may order military operations against other governments without provocation and without congressional authorization. And this week we are beginning to learn details of the so-called Federal Data Hub, including an excellent article by John Fund of the National Review. According to Fund, quote, the Department of Health and Human Services is about to hire an army of patient navigators to inform Americans about the subsidized insurance promised by Obamacare and assist them in enrolling. These organizers will be guided by the new Federal Data Hub, which will give them access to reams of personal information compiled by federal agencies ranging from the IRS to the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration. Mr. Speaker, the American people are slowly beginning to realize the threat to individual freedom, personal privacy, and fundamental constitutional principles that these developments pose. Some very bright constitutional lines have been crossed. And my constituents keep asking, what is Congress going to do? Well, the House has taken the first steps to restore our constitutional checks and balances by focusing its investigatory attention on the unfolding IRS scandal. It is of critical importance that the facts of the case be fully laid out, those responsible identified and removed from positions of trust or authority, and safeguards enacted to ensure that this sort of abuse never happens again. And the House Rules Committee took an important step yesterday by allowing amendments to the Defense Appropriations Act to stop the warrantless seizure of Americans' phone and Internet records by the NSA, and to reassert the essential principle with respect to Syria that Congress alone has the prerogative to declare war. The House is in a position to resist many of these abuses and usurpations through its power to appropriate, but it's often been reluctant to fully assert that authority. The conventional wisdom is that the appropriations process will shortly stall and a continuing resolution will be agreed to. That would be a tragic mistake if it leads to the continued funding of these increasingly unconstitutional and authoritarian measures. All appropriations must start in the House, which means that a simple majority of this body by itself could arrest many of these disturbing developments simply by marshaling the courage and determination to just say no by pulling the purse strings shut. If we fail to do so, I believe that we are allowing our nation to drift dangerously toward a constitutional crisis with grave implications to the rule of law and to the survival of American liberty. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I come from the 9th District of Georgia, and it's a pleasure always to be back there because of the mountains and the rural nature of our district, and there's so many businesses that make up in the economic engines from our agriculture to our industries. But they're also the backbone that is played out in the 9th District, and this morning I rise to honor one of those, what I say, backbones of our economic development, and that is one of our EMCs. In fact, I rise to honor the Habersham Electric Membership Corporation as it approaches an important milestone. This week, the Habersham EMC will mark its 75th anniversary of providing clean, reliable, affordable energy to homes and businesses in northeast Georgia. The Habersham EMC serves Hall, Lumpkin, White, Stevens, and Rayburn counties, as well as its namesake, Habersham County. Habersham EMC is an innovative, member-owned cooperative that provides power to more than 33,000 members and maintains approximately 3,700 miles of line. I had the pleasure of stopping by the Habersham EMC a few months ago to speak with their leadership of this great organization. Todd Pelock and his staff and the board of directors are wonderful examples of servant leadership that provide an invaluable service to their community. While I'm sorry to miss the 75th anniversary celebration, I want to extend my congratulations and best wishes to all of the Habersham EMC employees and members. I hope the next 75 years will bring even more innovation and continued success in providing the affordable energy needed to fuel our economy. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
The House returns at noon Eastern to begin debate on the rules governing two 2014 spending bills, defense and transportation, housing and urban development. The Rules Committee yesterday voted to allow 100 amendments to be offered to the defense spending bill, including several Republican amendments that would restrict the NSA's data collection authority and also block military aid to Syrian rebels and the Egyptian military. The White House yesterday issued a veto threat against the 2014 defense spending bill, saying in a statement that the lack of spending cuts within the bill would, quote, hurt our economy and require draconian cuts to middle-class priorities, end quote. Debate and amendments to the defense spending bill expected late into this evening. We'll have live House coverage here at noon Eastern when members gavel back in.